Let's see if this is a familiar scenario to you. You're a mindfulness teacher and you're really good at what you do, teaching and sharing mindfulness with your participants and students. But there's a gap. You need to make a living doing this, and it's challenging for you because business stuff, marketing, sales, that's a little bit outside of your range of specialty. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Hello and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. Glad you could be here. Thanks so much for watching. And before we get started with today's episode, I ask that you be sure to like and subscribe. It's how other people find this, from hearing from you and seeing that it's something worth watching. Now, our topic today is around how those of us who might not be the most experienced with businessy stuff, the sales, the marketing of our programs, what resources are there for us to do this better? Today's guest is someone who has set up an environment to help with that. And by the way, this is going to be a companion episode with next week's on how to do all of that and maintain the authenticity and the integrity of the programs that we're teaching. So be sure to stay tuned for that as well. Now let's talk with our guest, Colleen. Our guest today is Colleen Camenisch. Colleen, good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
And it's just so delightful to get a chance to speak with you here for the podcast because as you and I have discussed offline, we're kind of cousins from UMass. And I got to see you at a recent retreat and then at the International Conference on Mindfulness. So thank you so much for being here. Really glad to spend this time with you. And I'm wondering if you could, just by way of introduction for people who are watching this, give a short overview of who are you and what do you do in mindfulness?
Okay, yes. Who am I? That's a great question, especially if you follow the Buddhist tradition at all. It's like, who knows? It's probably changing on a regular basis, but I am somebody who actually comes out of the business world. So I have an MBA, a master's degree in business. I also have a postgraduate degree in international business and trade law. And early in my life, I really wanted to, like, I knew I felt passionate about doing something to have an impact. I really wanted to work for the United Nations. That was like a big part of my path. Um, and then at a certain point, I kind of realized like that wasn't going to be the path for me. And I was also trying to figure out sort of myself and what world I wanted to be in. And I took an MBSR class and it changed my life. And I was very skeptical. I just want to say going in, I was like, is this going to be like a bunch of hippies? And I'm spending like, I actually moved to Massachusetts because at the time there were not online classes and there was not a lot happening on the West Coast. So I moved to Massachusetts for 8 weeks to take the program. In a very short period of time, it really changed my life. And I was lucky enough that Saki Santorelli just happened to be teaching. He hadn't taught in 13 years, and he taught my class. And I remember thinking, if I could be a little bit more like him, I'm going to keep doing this. Like there was just so much wisdom, and just the way that he could listen to people and the insight that he had. So that really inspired me, kind of like started my whole journey. And I was like, I think this is what I want to do. So I luckily Bob Stahl was living on the West Coast and he was like the only other place at the time where you could do teacher training. So I would commute to San Jose, which is like a 6-hour commute once a week to, I mean, 6 hours one direction. So I would commute there, commute back, did all the teacher training with him. And again, just like another incredible human being that really inspired me with like, was possible both through teaching and embodying these kind of practices. And then I taught on my own for like 5 years. And like I taught like 50 classes. I was very like dedicated and trying to use all my business skills to pull classes together. And I live in Reno, Nevada, which is like, it's actually an amazing place to start a business because they call it the biggest little city, and it's kind of like that. Like it seems big, but it's small and you can easily make connections. So then I taught for 5 years here and then eventually actually went back just to say thank you to Saki for how much he had changed my life. And we got to talking about like, well, do you ever have teaching positions open here? And he was like, would you come if there was? And eventually I ended up at UMass. I taught there, and then stayed on as an adjunct faculty, even though I moved back to Reno. And now I also work for Brown University as a MBSR teacher and teacher trainer. And I recently got I'm not certified yet. I'm qualified to teach mindfulness-based cognitive therapy as well. So that's my mindfulness path in a nutshell.
That is a lot, and thank you for giving that full background. And I'm sure for many of the listeners who happen to be teachers, some of that's going to be familiar of the changes that we make in our lives to do this. I'm from Minnesota and I'm in Massachusetts now after working for UMass and moving my wife and I halfway across the country to be able to do this work. So totally get it. And thank you for that overview. And I want us to dig into our topic for today. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how Mindfulness Standard got started and what that is.
Yeah, so the mindfulness standard kind of came out of my own experience teaching in the world, trying to be self-employed and be a teacher and figure out how to do all of that. And luckily, again, I have a master's degree in business, so I have some knowledge about how to navigate the business world. And I mean, the other thing I'll say is that Bob Stahl was like an amazing mentor to me and just shared so much knowledge about, what he was doing. And when I was at the Center for Mindfulness, I could just see that a lot of teachers struggled with, like, okay, now I know how to teach, but they didn't have any kind of like a business background. And it's like, what do I do next? And at the time, there wasn't a listing. I know now there are many listings, including one that you helped create. And so it was hard for like, I'm always thinking about the general public, like mindfulness has changed so much. How does the general public understand who's a qualified mindfulness teacher? Why is that even important? How is what we do different from an app? Like, I just think there are a lot of big questions out there for the general public. And so that was how we envisioned the mindfulness standard. And that was like really a decade ago, right after I left the center. I was like, we should have some kind of a listing. But then we kind of realized that's also not enough. Like in my experience before, like I know John Kabat-Zinn had cassette tapes, and then there were like CDs, which I had for years that I would pass out to people until there weren't CD players anymore. And then I was like, well, what do I do with my recordings? And look, I had dated a musician who helped me know about Bandcamp, and then like that helped me out for a while, but it got harder and harder to like deliver my materials to people and to also kind of meet people where they are now, which is not where they were 40 years ago when we had like workbooks and tapes. So we created a learning management platform essentially for teachers to take registrations, to have a virtual website, to have all their class materials, to host their recordings. So that was kind of like the inception of the mindfulness standard, was like, can we have some kind of a platform that would help mindfulness teachers run their businesses without all the administrative burdens? And really, I mean, it's expensive to create an app. So without all the expenses, and so that was kind of like the beginning, and it's evolved since then. I can talk about that, but I'll pause there for now.
That is a really fascinating background because what it shows is what so many mindfulness teachers run into. We come to this because we want to help people, typically, and we may have a background in meditation. We may be coming to it from a therapy kind of doorway or other different stories in our lives of how this has helped us with our own coping with what shows up. But that is a very different competency set than what makes a really good teacher.
Yeah.
And so hearing that, yeah, there does need to be help with that. I'm building my own setup now. And yes, I'm running into the same things that, yeah, I have some experience in, but I'm not an expert in marketing and sales and how to just make this available to people who need it. And you also brought up some wonderful points about the public perception of
Yeah.
this. And I gotta say, this is my third conversation today, again, within the field of mindfulness, of the importance of having trained teachers who do continuing education and have supervision and things like that. that's a very different experience than someone who purchases a bunch of scripts that they read. It's a very
Yes.
different thing, and the effects are not the same. So thank you for bringing up that as well. And let's hear a little bit about how this has evolved since you started this. What's that been like? How has that changed for you? What have you seen? And what's it been like for the people who participate in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we began like really actively working on it, I would say, right before the pandemic happened. And as probably many people know that are listening to this podcast, the field of people that are teaching different MBIs, MBSR, MBCT, mindfulness-based self-compassion, all the different MBIs that are out there, many of which I did not just name, have been impacted, in some way. I was teaching probably for 12 years with consistent classes, 5 times a year. And it just started to dramatically change after the pandemic. So obviously, our business model, which was to support teachers in teaching, changed because teachers weren't teaching as much. So, one of the things we used to have was a monthly subscription that you would pay for to have access to the platform. We changed it to a pay per class model because like our goal is to support teachers and not have them pay for something they're not doing. So that was one thing. Another thing is I spent many years working at a nonprofit micro lender for small disadvantaged business owners who primarily didn't have an education in business. And I learned a lot about helping people come up with business plans, but not like super robust business plans that they couldn't make actionable. And so we now have a business and marketing essentials course for mindfulness teachers to go through. It's a short, like 4-week course. And it's really cool. Like what people do over the course of it is they actually build a business plan and we give them some consulting tips, but we also help them one of the things about marketing, if you don't have a marketing degree, is you could spend a lot of money trying to capture everyone, and that's not that useful. And I think everybody is doing this work because it's the work of the heart. So I think for us, the biggest thing is like, what do you want to add value in the world with, and how can we help you follow that? And because of the context we're in, it has to be a business, at least in the West. We don't, it's not being supported in another way. And so how can we do that ethically and responsibly and in a way that feels good? Because I know that's a hard thing for a lot of teachers.
Yeah. And the challenge, one of the things we run into with that is so much of our roots are that meditation, contemplative practices, being reflective is free. So we have a hard time, many of us have a hard time, I certainly do, in charging for it.
Hmm.
And yet there's the reality of, yeah, I still got mortgage or rent, or got to put food on the table, things like that.
Yeah.
And resolving that in, as you beautifully said, ethically, in what way can we do this that is still supportive of the integrity of what it is we're doing and having it accessible for people. And I just released registration for my own MBSR course live online and made a point of having, in addition to these price breaks based on someone's situation, yeah, and if you're running into stuff, you're financially
Yeah.
having a hard time right now, as many of us are, let me know. And we're not
Hmm.
going to punish you with an application process that makes you feel bad for having a life, for having circumstances happen to you. So it's really an interesting and challenging conundrum for people who just want to help. So thank you for bringing that up. And Colleen, for people who are participating in this or interested in it, what are some of the success stories that you're hearing, and what are some of the challenges that people are still running into with this?
Yeah, well, I can say myself included, it's still challenging to figure out where how are we filling our classes? And I just want to highlight one piece because I don't think people have to think about this. But what you were just saying about, like I have never not let someone into my class because they couldn't afford it. So I
Yeah.
think, that's a nice starting place. And there are so many grants available out there to reach populations we might not have thought about. A lot of the work that I do now is grant based. So I just like to remind people too, it's like there are still ways that we can reach these, populations that might not ever be exposed to mindfulness in creative ways. So I think that is one of the things that has come out of it, like the sense of community that's come out of the teachers, just even getting to talk about this challenge with each other. I think as we all know, like if we've been teaching somewhere in the world, it can be isolating and lonely and hard to figure out. And I think just having a community is really helpful. So I think that's something. And then we've seen lots of really cool, especially with the business and marketing essentials classes now. It's been like cool to see how motivated people are coming in and like the actionable things they have at the end of it, like a website or like I'm gonna like target this new audience or see if I can get a grant with this organization. So it's been really neat to see how much intention people are bringing to it and how, I don't know, I kind of think about when John started MBSR, how he, of course, there's a form, but there's how every individual teacher is going to embody it. And I feel like that's a little part of what we get to see is like, this is this person's manifestation of how they want to bring this into the world. And we help them maybe get like a little bit closer to it.
Yeah, and that warp and the weft, that article about how there's the curriculum, but there's also the person of the teacher, and
Yeah.
that brings that uniqueness to it, let alone the uniqueness of each cohort going through an MBI makes it special. And why we'll never be bored in this, teaching the same program again and again. It's like, no, each time it is very, very different.
Yes.
So, Colleen, to finish up, what words of encouragement might you have for some people who are starting out, and how can people get hold of you and the mindfulness standard?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my most recent words of encouragement are for all of us to, I mean, I think a big part of what I've been doing personally, and I think what shows up in the mindfulness standard, I didn't talk about, we have like a research end of our platform too. And that came out of me realizing that in different organizations I was teaching in, they had different needs than what fit exactly in the MBSR curriculum. And so I think I've been thinking personally a lot about like, okay, in what other way could I manifest something that's meaningful? And then, for me, having data is really important. So we have, some researchers on our platform experimenting with different forms. We're doing that ourselves. And I think for a lot of MBSR teachers too, but you might have had a lot of students that you taught even in the past or classes that you did fill. And it's like often those people are still looking for community and touch points. And that's not something that's been offered. So I don't know. I think one of the things is like that for us all to remember to keep being creative. Like we have this really amazing foundation of MBSR or MBCT or whatever MBI pathway you went down that had a lot of integrity and training, and you know something about that form. And just based on who you are and the work that you want to do, how else could that be manifested that might meet the needs of what's happening right now? And I think for me, that's just been like a shift that I want to keep exploring. And I think that the field is really exploring like what's called for now. You know, I ask myself that question all the time with my practice. And it's like, I think in doing this work, we have to keep asking ourselves that too. What's called for now and how can we meet that? So I would say just be creative, and the world, I think we all know more than ever really needs these practices. And so I think it's important not to give up, and just to keep, I don't know, being in community with each other, talking about what's working and helping each other.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And for those who are watching or listening, links are available in the spot where links are found for this stuff, including to Mindfulness Standard. Our guest today, Colleen Camenisch. Colleen, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. Hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Ted.
It is so interesting to think about the different competencies that are needed to stand up a mindfulness business and do so well. I'm pretty good with strategic planning, but not so good at marketing and sales. That's outside of my territory. thankfully, there are people like Colleen who are really, really good at this stuff. So thank you, Colleen, for your time today. And again, everyone, please do hit the subscribe button for this. It helps. Remember, every moment you have a choice, make it the best you can, and I'll see you next time on Mindfulness Voyage.